Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Diana Ushiyama. My name is Judge Stephanie Miller, and I am one of the co-chairs of the IJA's Wellness Committee. And as this is our year of wellness, we are trying to bring forward speakers that everybody can glean important knowledge and information about. And Dr. Diana is definitely one of those individuals. She is the executive director of Illinois Lawyers Assistance Program, also known as LAP. Before joining LAP, she was the administrator of psychological services for DuPage County and ran a licensing outpatient substance abuse treatment program, including mental health substance abuse programs. Prior to her involvement there, she actually was an assistant public defender in Cook County in various courtrooms at 26 in California and in Chicago for over a decade. She obtained her law degree from Pepperdine University School of Law, and she is a prolific writer and nationally recognized speaker in the areas of judicial, legal, lawyer, law student, health, and wellness issues, which fits right into our theme. So, Dr. Diana, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Judge. I appreciate it. It's always great to talk to you and to kind of talk about, like, you know, the stigma surrounding like the work we do impacts who we become. I like to say that when I was lawyering, I was surrounded by dysfunction, but it seemed so normal to me until I left the field. And then I was like, why did that seem normal to me? So I think when you're in settings where there's a lot of dysfunction going around, you know what, you can normalize the experience that's just how it is. So, you know, obviously, you know, the Lawyers Assistance Program, hopefully, obviously we help judges, lawyers, and law students. Rule 21 that was instituted last year by the Illinois Supreme Court has increased outreach from judges directly to LAP. The chief judges are making direct referrals to us. I do a thorough assessment. I have many judges on my caseload. It's an opportunity for people to get assistance and help in a safe, confidential manner. And as a result of that, we're actually, like I say, infiltrating the stigma that everyone deserves help in the legal profession, including judges. So, you know, obviously, I think most people who know me, many of you don't, but I am a military mama too. So I have a trauma is something that I really keep up on. And it's something that I train in on a perpetual basis because it has a tremendous impact on who we become. And, you know, my son was in Afghanistan during the worst of it. And we talk all the time about the lasting implications of trauma on the system and how you are perpetually changed. And so with that, I'm going to talk to you about the expectations that we can be immersed in suffering and loss on a daily basis and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. That is really important to understand the concept that the daily grind of what we see never goes away, right? In some ways, I say lawyering and judging is boots on the ground in the legal community, where we see things that we never may have experienced or known what was going on in the world around us, but that occurs on a perpetual basis. I watched a documentary a couple of months ago called In the Line of Service, and they talk about moral injury, that sometimes there's a moral injury that takes place as a result of witnessing or seeing things that go against moral strains of who we are as human beings. And I really believe that post-traumatic stress disorder, vicarious trauma, are results of the exposure, the repeated exposure to suffering in ways that go against our moral fiber and understanding. So I just put this up. Now there's other studies, judicial studies as well, but basically we are not a healthy profession. This is an old antiquated study. We are actually going to launch a statewide survey, hopefully of lawyers and the judiciary about health and wellness coming out of the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, 21 to 28% of lawyers indicate they have an active substance use problem. 28% say they have depressive disorders. 19% say they have anxiety disorders, and 23% say they're under chronic stress. But I can actually tell you, as a practicing attorney, I was always under chronic stress, but I would have only identified it when I had a trial or a Class X felony or something where there was a lot at stake. But the reality was my caseloads were always high. There were pressures on me to do the best I could, even in cases that were very difficult. And, you know, I was talking to someone who's on my caseload, a member of the judiciary, and they said, I always feel like I have to make moral judgments against people with limited options. And I thought that was a beautiful way to capture, you know, that people can make mistakes, right? And people can show remorse, but sometimes sentencing guidelines are strict and difficult. And so anyway, the problem is not that we only experience problems, we don't get help for them. So even under normal times when you could access people easily, because right now caseloads are huge on mental health caseloads. So a lot of people are turning down clients. A lot of people aren't taking insurance anymore because the coverage is so poor. So it's been harder to access. But only 37% of those who identified as having mental health problems actually got help under normal times. And for substance use problems, only 7% did. So we know that there's a lot of problems related to why people don't get help. And there's been statistics that have been released related to the members of the judiciary that show even less outreach, only because where do you go? How do you keep your suffering from being known to the general public? How do you, if you're in a rural community, get help if you're depressed, if you're anxious, if you have a substance use problem? It's very unlikely that you're going to go to a provider in your community because of safety issues and also fear of being outed in your own community where you have stature. So these are very, very compelling reasons why people don't get help, and they feel very unwilling to. So the beauty of LAP is that I like to say that we are the keeper of secrets, and nobody knows what I know. And unless you sign a release of information, I can't share that with anyone. And the other thing is I've been working with many chief judges who refer to me, and I say it's got to be a limited release, meaning you can know if a person shows up and you can know if a person complies, but there must be a feeling of safety so that everyone can get the help they need without fear of everyone knowing what is wrong, because that is where problems come, and we get people who are less likely to seek help. So here are some professional liability risk factors. Now, burnout, it can be, and I'm going to go into some of these later, but it's a product of who we are and the environments we work in. So, we had our fundraiser last week, and I said I'm a maladaptive perfectionist in recovery with intermittent relapses. And that's very true. So who I am sets me up for higher levels of burnout because I push. And if I'm in an environment where they push together, that is a side effect of work environments, but also the personalities that work within those environments. Compassion fatigue, and we're going to talk a lot about this, is the very qualities that make us want to do this work set us up for the fall. And that if we don't offset our empathic qualities and our other qualities that make us want to do this work, then over time we will deteriorate. Now, vicarious trauma is, like I say, I don't ever forget anything I saw in the criminal justice field, especially when I was doing death penalty eligible cases, child abuse cases, right? Sex abuse cases. I see a lot of judges on my caseload who are in high volume courtrooms, whether it's abuse and neglect, whether it's sexual abuse, whether it's family law, where there's a lot of conflict, and that conflict
gets stored in us because the exposure to it over and over again impacts who we become over time. And then also ambiguous endings, right? There are sentencing, there is a concept of justice, but it's elusive, right? Depending on what side you're on. And really, how do you make anyone in the system whole? And then, of course, professional uncertainty. I was at a presentation where a judge said we shouldn't be complaining because we are who everyone wants to aspire to be. And in many ways, that's correct. But it also, the higher we climb, the easier it is to fall from above. And so, how do I keep my professional stature while seeking help for whatever may be happening in my personal life, in my professional life? So why is the legal community vulnerable? Well, when I went to law school, there was not a single class that taught me how do you stay well when you work with unwell populations? And I'm still looking for that class, and nobody teaches it. Now, when I got my master's and then my doctorate in clinical and forensic psychology, that's all we talked about. How do you stay healthy when working with unhealthy populations? And that's part of the problem, is that we go into this not recognizing that there's a degree of risk involved in the work we do, and then we don't get any training to teach us how to stay well. So part of what I'm doing here is to make you aware, and then to give you some skills that may help you minimize what you might be experiencing, and to make you more aware that the more you do, the more you're exposed, the more you are going to have long-term physical, mental health, substance use, or maladaptive coping mechanisms. And so how do we create healthy coping mechanisms instead of using things that actually undermine us or make us unwell? And then, part of who we are, I would like to say about myself that I consider myself the one who can help people with problems. But what happens when I have the problem? It's hard for me to take that hat off of problem solver and say problem haver. And so all of us struggle with that when we are in a line of work where we feel a little bit immune from the side effects and are unwilling to recognize that we may be struggling and having difficulties as well. So at any given time, on any given day, trauma is there. It will walk in on a Wednesday and wreck a seemingly ordinary week. Now that can come from a caseload. It can come from incivility in the courtroom. It can come from a particular case. It can come from constant exposure. It can come from conflict at home or difficulty at home, and then coming to work and being exposed to it. It can come from witnessing an accident. It can come from so many avenues, right? Where, it's interesting when you look at the history of the DSM, which is like the Bible for mental health clinicians, we use it to formulate diagnoses. But the history of PTSD in veterans is, we used to not recognize that it was a side effect of war. And then way back in Austria, there was a term that was called soldier's heart. And nostalgia. And then after World War I, we called it shell shock. And then after World War II, we called it battle fatigue or combat stress reaction. And so I want to put words on the fact that this exposure is something that impacts us. Now, I recently went to a wedding with a lot of veterans. And my son was there. And he introduced me to a lot of people. And then slowly a bunch of them came around later in the evening and they started talking about, I don't feel like I have PTSD, but I feel like I'm different, that I'm not the same, that I don't experience emotions like I used to. I can't feel happiness when I'm surrounded by happy times. I can't feel things like I used to. And that is a sign of PTSD, right? It is a sign of this shell shock, battle fatigue, combat stress reaction, whatever you want to call it. But it is a side effect in working in traumatic situations over time. So, one-time stress, right? The DSM actually started talking about PTSD in 1952 when they were trying to put words into this diagnosis, right? And that was the first time we said there is a diagnosis called PTSD, but we never put it into the DSM until later, until 1980. That's how long it took, because when the Vietnam veterans came home, we knew something had happened, something had changed them. And frankly, a lot of this moral injury that I talked about, where you're experiencing things that are outside your moral comfort zone, and witnessing things, it sets people up for higher levels of PTSD and long-term side effects from it. So, one-time stress, like I could look at my emails, and I probably have 30 since I started this talk. And then what do I have to finish by 5 o'clock? And, I'm trying to keep up on latest studies. But when you hear about trauma situations, it's interesting because sometimes the experience of, I just met with a client whose daughter was sexually assaulted in college recently. And she indicated that the outcry of the sexual trauma to her was so difficult that she was having difficulty sleeping at night since the outcry. Now, obviously, it's her daughter, but it's also the impact of how violent the situation was. So she has secondary traumatic stress from knowing, right, that. And then if you witness it, right, the people who come to court to testify, there is much more trauma involved in witnessing and seeing something, being an observer. And then when you're in the moment of trauma, that has the highest degree of PTSD and secondary trauma response syndrome that you kind of infiltrate. Now, there is a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He's a psychiatrist who deals with trauma. And he says that trauma gets stored in the body. And I love the book, and it's something that everyone should read. It doesn't go away unless we process it. And so we need to be vigilant about how the work we're doing is impacting us, because to pretend it's not is a fallacy. It is not true. This work erodes the foundation of who we are, and then who we will become. Now, the other thing is that we often, I'm just going to be honest, are the worst people to assess our own internal dysfunction. We are the worst people to assess that. You know who determines that and who we won't listen to? The people in our lives. Is everything okay? Are you okay? Why are you so irritable? Why are you so angry? It seems like you have a lot of problems. What's going on? Can I help you? And we push them away. And the reality is they're seeing the changes in us that we have a very, very difficult time seeing. So one of the things I teach about, I have a presentation called The Jaded Lawyer or The Jaded Judge, is how cynical we get over time, right? I think about who I was when I first started in the system, and I was so hopeful and so young and naive. And now I'm much more practical, right? But I would say that over time, I am not the same person that I was. And I recently went to a high school reunion, and I had this moment where I was like, I wonder who I was back then and how people perceive me, because who I am now is different. It's a different version of the earlier version, because over time, what we see, what we experience changes us. So a trauma and exposure response, we have to watch. Sometimes people in the judicial arena get into trouble because they have high rates of burnout and compassion fatigue. And over time, what they're experiencing is more irritability, more anger outbursts. We see people making statements on the bench that are inappropriate. It could be that we no longer feel empathy for the people who come before us, right? Because we've seen this before. And we engage in a lot of self-numbing behaviors. So let's talk about numbing behaviors. We all have one. Let's be honest. We all do something that makes us feel better when we are overwhelmed emotionally. And the key is, what is yours? Is it food? Is it drink? Is it prescription medication? Is it marijuana? Is it a combination of all? Is it compulsive gambling? Is it sex addiction? Is it compulsive shopping? Is it Netflix binges? Is it losing yourself on the internet? It could be working out too much to the point where you debilitate. I see that as well. But we all have something, right? Like pandemic 28, the high rate of substance use increase. Those are numbing behaviors that take place when we feel overwhelmed, when we're under chronic stress, when we're burnt out, when we're suffering from compassion fatigue. And we have to be careful that our own grandiosity isn't interfering with our ability to know, do I need help? Am I the one who is the problem that is not managing this? And I'm becoming less effective, less empathic, less good at my job, right? And we need to be honest about that. And we also see physical deteriorations, right? Chronic stress not only leads to mental health and substance use problems, but it leads to a deterioration of physical functioning. Cortisol should not be infused into our system on a perpetual basis. If it is, it's going to lead to some chronic illnesses and chronic physical problems. So we got to watch that. It can lead to higher levels of cardiovascular behavior. It can lead to sleep problems. So we need to be careful that what we're doing is not causing a decline in our symptoms, decline in our functioning, and increasing symptoms. So here's what this is just a kind of a snapshot between the difference between burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. Obviously, this is a 1-hour presentation. I did make my phone number available to all. You can always call me, message me. I will answer any questions. But what you see are, in all of them, you see symptoms that are not just physical, but emotional, and then how you can be triggered. So oftentimes, this is an interesting thing that I see, that many people would not identify as being depressed in this profession, whether you're a judge or a lawyer, but have a form of what I call agitated depression. Now, I want you to be honest with yourself. It looks like this. It's like living with a teenager. You are much more irritable, much more defensive, and more prone to anger outbursts. And you have this low frustration tolerance, and you have a disrespect sensitivity to being disrespected. Sound familiar? And when that happens, you get tweaked and you have these outbursts. It means you can get up every day. It's not that you can't get out of bed and function, but the way you're functioning to the outside world is, ooh, watch that. Now, I worked in many courtrooms where I was placed in them for short amounts of time way back when. Now, this was the old way of managing judicial issues, but I remember one particular person, there was a 6-month window where you would be rotated in and rotated out because the attorneys declined in functioning being around this abusive judge. And, going backwards in time, my thought is, I wonder what was happening there. And also, when you have untreated mental health and untreated substance use problems, there is a recovery process where you show up every day, but you're less and less effective over time and may be more prone to this recovery period, which sets you up for this irritability. So, compassion fatigue, again, is separate from burnout. Like I told you, burnout is a side effect of who we are and the environments we work in. So I worked once in a courtroom where 140 to 160 felony trials, and I would have said I was only under stress during a trial, and that was a lie. And over time, of course, I'm going to deteriorate, correct? And the reality is, of course, I'll be less compassionate over time because my exposure level is so high that managing the pieces of who I am and my expectations with an environment that's high demand and with this trauma that I see over and over again, where I really can't make people whole, and it's this elusive concept, is really, really challenging and difficult. And so that's why physical
A lot of people have physical functioning problems and are willing to identify those
before they're willing to say something's wrong with my mental health,
my substance use problems are out of control,
I drink too much, I eat too much, I drug too much.
but these things are the result of the work environments we come from. So compassion fatigue is this cumulative effect of being continually exposed to the pain and desperation of others.
And it begins to affect our own personal life. So think about this. In all courtroom settings, we are exposed to people who are struggling, suffering, wanting to be made whole, and regardless of what setting you work in, right? If even, you can say that some divisions have less dysfunction than others, but even if people are fighting over property and fighting over a will and contesting a will, there is so much dysfunction. Family law, it's like there's so much conflict that you're continually exposed to that it impacts us over time. And so symptoms of compassion fatigue, I like to talk about this a lot. Here in a live presentation, I'd say raise your hand if you consider yourself empathic. And most of you would raise your hand, me too. And I would say, did you know that that creates more pathways for you to develop compassion fatigue? Makes sense, right?
And if I said, who's a perfectionist in this audience, I would raise my hand.
Hand, as with most of you. And I would say, well, that sets you up too. And I would say, who thinks they're a problem solver? Raise your hand, and we would all raise our hands. And that sets you up. The other thing that sets us up is that if we have a history of our own trauma, you were a victim of domestic violence, sexually abused, grew up with an abusive or neglectful parent, are in a dysfunctional, abusive relationship, whether it's emotional or physical. If you have a child who is sexually assaulted, then you will be right picking for compassion fatigue. It's like an inroad into suffering, right? And so all of these symptoms become part of who we are. And over time, there's an erosion of the soul. So you know how the lake waters and the ocean waters are rising and the soil and the beaches are eroding? I call compassion fatigue and burnout soul erosion mechanisms, that it takes away bits and pieces of who we are as it creeps up without us even becoming aware of it, until sometimes it's too late and we lose relationships. We have dysfunctional relationships with our children, with our significant others. We have angry outbursts on the bench. We get sanctioned, disciplined. We come before the gym, whatever the reason is. There's so much loss involved with it that I say, let's be proactive rather than reactive. Now, like I told you, I'm a trauma-informed care provider, but it's very important to recognize when we work in these communities that this process through which our inner experience is negatively transformed through hearing material from traumatic situations, basically. So how does this look? I always use myself as a mechanism for understanding. One time I was co-counsel on a murder case, and it was a horrific case of murder on a child who was dragged into a van and then sexually assaulted and murdered. And I came home one day, and I had 3 little kids, and I sat down to dinner, and here's me thinking, I've processed this all on my drive home, my 45-minute commute. I'm in a good place. I'm going to sit with my kids for dinner, and we're eating, and they're telling stories, and I say, hey, I just wanted to tell you something. I know I always teach you to be polite, but if a van pulls up next to you and my son pipes in, the one who just came back and just retired from the Army, he says, oh gosh, Mom's doing a terrible case and she's scared for us. And it was so true, but I wanted to protect them from all the things that I saw. And then, my daughter, my youngest, is a trauma nurse, and she was working in the city. And I said, hey, just FBI, always check underneath your car and in the back. And she goes, Mom. And I said, well, I'm just telling you what I know, right? That sometimes people are underneath the cars at late at night, and she works the night shift. So I just wanted her to be safe. So it's still there. It always creeps in. And so this exposure changes who we are. So they're having that. It's very normal, but it's like it's not going away no matter how much time goes by. And it changes our outlook about safety in the world, safety amongst us, and who we are, right? So our change in our worldview, and then the spectrum of responses. Neutral, I'm trying to manage this. And I would say, you know, I'm in a place where I'm neutral, but there have been times where it was negative, right? Because I was overly vigilant. I was so worried. And then, you know, positive, I think I have resilience, but how do we take who we are, where we were, and create this neutral or positive experience so that we don't deteriorate over time? So, you know, risk factors for vicarious trauma, I think the court settings in general, right? The position that you're in where you make decisions about people's lives, right? These are complex, difficult clients exposed to high levels of trauma. I was at a presentation where someone said, you know, when you were working with people in the Cook County Public Defender's Office, how often did you come across people who didn't have a history of trauma or systemic trauma or substance use or mental health problems? And I was like, huh, I don't think I ever came across that. And it's kind of this legacy of, you know, poverty, of these situations where people come from systemic problems, but it's this cumulative place where they all show up in our courtrooms. And, you know, large caseloads and large percentage of clients who share a lot of their history. And then it's cumulative. And so sometimes over time, people get more isolated. Who can you tell these stories to except people who work with you, who know this? But you know, on the cases where I have members of the judiciary, there is no support group. I would love to create a support group where people can show up in a room where I run a support group and people can process some of the things they see, because similar to the military, that it requires a processing of difficult sex cases, difficult juvenile cases, difficult family law cases, difficult adjudication cases, right? These things create a level of stress and strain on our systems that are really, really difficult to manage over time. And then lack of resources, right? In small communities, who do I turn to? I just have to buck up and I have to show up and I have to do what's expected of me. And there's no time to complain. And, you know, frankly, I work with a lot of people who've asked for transfers out of high volume courtrooms. We don't look at these kind of places sometimes as needing some sabbatical. And I think people would get into less problems if we had a little bit of a reprieve. Let's rotate people in these high volumes, high stress courtrooms out and in, so that they can get a little bit of respite to recover and feel better about what they're doing and be healthy individuals. So the question is, who are you? Who are you in this system? What is your own personal history? How does that add into the picture that we're seeing that's currently happening with you? What's going on around you? Are you stressed in your home life? I always tell people, there's a saying that I used to say, I'm only as happy as my most dysfunctional child, right? I have 3 kids, but you know, as you're raising them and they're navigating the world and sometimes driving you crazy, and some kids struggle, it's like, that's going to impact who I am and what I'm capable of on any given day. And then what if I don't have a lot of friends that I can turn to? And, you know, I think that I've gotten better at that over time. But I would say that when I hear people who tell their story about what they've experienced, I find them to be the bravest, most courageous people, because I would say most of my life previously, I would never have been able to share that, because I looked at it as being deficient or not having enough skills and not wanting people to know that I wasn't doing well. So who are you, and do you have a network of people that you can turn to, who can support you, and who you could talk to? And if you don't, that's something that we need to figure out how to create that. Being new in the field, right, as a new judge, or in a new area of being a judge, can expose you to higher levels, right? Because, you know, there's this imposter syndrome, and we're afraid of failing, and then we're exposed to things that overwhelm us, and so that may also impact how much we let into our system, and then having unrealistic expectations of being able to save or cure all of your clients. I think that, you know, sometimes I want more for my clients, and that's when I have to step away a little bit. That going at my pace is not for everyone. And so that's what I had to learn as a therapist is, you know, I can't drag people along. They've got to want to do it. And some people start and stall and start and stall, and that's their life. And I have to accept that regardless of whether I think that's good for them. And so, you know, I like to tell this story that I went to the airport about 6 months ago, and I had the most interesting Uber driver. He showed up, and he was just this dynamic personality. And long story short, he told me when he found out, he wanted to know, he told me he grew up on the West Side, he got addicted to heroin. And then he told me he had been in and out of substance use treatment and in and out of jail. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, I'm in the Uber with him. But the long end of the story was this man finally recovered. And he attributed it to one particular judge who gave him a break in sentencing. And he said, it was then that I kicked it. I knew this was my last chance. And this judge at 26 in California gave me my chance. And so as I'm getting out of the Uber, he screams to me, you tell Judge so-and-so that he saved me, and I am a new man, and 2 of my kids went to college. And everyone at the airport turned to look at me, and I said, okay, I will. And I called that judge, and I said, I need to tell you this story. And the judge said to me, I needed to hear that, because sometimes I feel like no matter what I do, I'm not instituting change. And I never always, you know, very rarely do I see the long-term effects of some of these tough decisions I made. And so that's a beautiful summary to, you know, like my field, I never know the impact I may have on someone unless they share it with me. And, you know, it's not a field where that's what your expectation should be. So what we are change mechanisms, and we do the best we can given the situation. So, you know, this over-identification with the client or over-involvement with them. I see people all the time who do this too much, right? I'm the only one who can help them. I'm the only one they trust. Well, you know, as I like to say, we should all be replaceable. And when we make ourselves the only instrument to fix people, that becomes a problem in and of itself. And then if you have more stressors in your personal life, I can tell you this 100%, that when I have more stress on my home front, I am less effective on my work front. And that is something I talk about, creating and knowing what's my threshold today. Every day is different. So I might want to be here, but I'm actually here. I might come in here and get more done on this day, but if I come in here and expect to come up here and do all this stuff, I'm going to feel like a failure. And so I have to manage myself and my expectations on a daily basis. Every day before I get out of bed, I say, what's my threshold? What's my capacity? What's on my plate, and how do I manage it? And distancing ourselves from people. So we see this a lot. It's that dissociation, you know, where we become less and less involved, and we need to stay more and more involved with the people that care about us. But anger being an output, irritability being an output, I see many people whose ability to tolerate normal day-to-day nuances deteriorate over time. And then there is grief associated with all of this. We have changed, we grieve the changes to ourselves, we grieve the things we can fix. We grieve the systemic problems. We grieve the loss of who we were. Like, who was I in high school? You know, I was this, you know, I had so much hope, and I still do. I still think I'm as almost as optimistic as I was then, with a reality barometer of what I've actually seen, but also grief of all the traumas that we see on a regular basis. So, you know, when we feel disconnected from ourselves, if there is this trauma response, dissociation, I don't feel as happy, I don't feel as carefree, I don't feel as involved. I'm physically present, but I'm not there. I feel more negative and more angry about the world, about my job, about the people I work with. I don't, my faith has diminished over time. My spirituality has diminished. I don't believe that people are inherently good. Those are all signs. Changes to sense of self. I don't feel the same. I don't feel like I have the ability to balance all the pieces. I get overly emotional, overly angry. I had a male judge who told me that they had a crying outburst that was so shocking to them in front of one of their colleagues. They felt humiliated, but it was this person had experienced the whole series of cases that were really difficult. It had no one to talk to and process this, and the judge's children. And so this was so much intensity to the feelings of, my God, this is awful stuff. This numbing or hardness, it can go both ways, this depersonalization and cynicism over time. And so we get much more detached, much more aggressive or irritable or easily frustrated. You know, we just over time deteriorate without always recognizing the symptoms of who we are changing, being part of the experience. And the personal impact of vicarious trauma, there is physical changes, right? Trauma, you know, if you think about veterans, so sometimes it's easier to think about the trauma response in wartime, combat. What do we hear about people in combat? Increased heart rate, more physical symptoms. I saw a documentary about a man who had these crushing headaches until he got a service dog, which diminished over time, but there were physical symptoms, impaired immune systems, you get sick or fatigue, you can't get out of bed, your body hurts, emotional, you know, we talked about that, behavioral, we talked about that, spiritual, I talked about that, cognitive, this is an interesting thing. I get a lot of referrals for people in cognitive decline on the bench and in the law. And I do a thorough assessment, right? I do a lot of rule outs. And what I find usually is a lot of physical functioning problems that never have been identified. So I have people get comprehensive blood work. I do cognitive screenings. I do full assessments to determine personal stressors. But what happens is that we get less capable without knowing we're less capable and still pushing ourselves to be just like we were before. And so you want to always take note of changes in your functioning. And then relational problems. My gosh, who amongst us hasn't been witnessed or been privy to seeing relationships fall apart in some of these high volume courtrooms, these high dysfunctional systems, whether it's military, police, courts. It's really a fascinating thing where we become less capable in a relational standpoint as well. So the personal impact, and I told you the story of, you know, I worried about the safety of my kids much more, right? I talked about, you know, even officer friendly, you know, you got to be careful, scream as loud as you can. If anyone tries to talk to you, don't worry about being polite, and always check your environment, never have two headphones in at the same time, right? These are the things that I've been telling my kids since they were little. And so, you know, a lot of times we worry about being betrayed or, you know, what people are going to say about us. We sometimes try to control too much because control feels like we're in control. But we, you know, I try to teach people, what are you actually in control of? You think you're in control of more But what you fear is the inability to control some of these variables that have never been in your control, and then less able to be open emotionally to people because nobody can understand your work, which is true for many people, right? And then, feeling guilty all the time, and having maybe negative sexual side effects as a result. Interpersonal problems. We talked about this, that we either get angry at the system or angry at those around us, and it shows, right? Again, we've exceeded the threshold, and we haven't managed ourselves appropriately. We haven't tried to balance it with other ways so that we remain healthy and more balanced over time. So, working vicarious trauma, sometimes it gets us into trouble. Sometimes we overdo. Sometimes we can't see what's happening to us. Sometimes we have intrusive thoughts. Now, I do remember a horrible case that a judge told me, and we were somewhere where there were similar circumstances, and all of a sudden my whole family got mad at me. I went, and there was a trigger of hearing the story and being in a similar circumstance, and I had this intrusive thought where it overwhelmed me, and my family's like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing that?" And I was like, "Oh my God, I'm okay. Like they thought, like, what is wrong with this person? And it was just that visualization of that event that had been told to me. And then I had to process that as well on my own with help from a friend of mine. So professional impact of vicarious trauma is that our performance can be impacted. And I get a lot of calls on this, right? Something is wrong. This person used to be like this and is now doing this. This person isn't doing their job, right? Production decreases, performance issues arise, right? There's less tolerance. It may be that, there's all these things going on at work that you're no longer able to manage. You may not feel as confident. Sometimes I get judges who are moved into new places and they don't feel confident and they worry about looking incompetent. And that creates this imposter syndrome. And so we create strategies to make people more effective moving in transitions. I want to make sure that we all say this out loud. Most of us are not good during periods of transition, and we have to prepare for that, right? Transitions are hard. We usually get worse before we get better because there's all these feelings that come out during periods. There's too much uncertainty. We're high perfectionists. We like to know, we like to be in control, and we feel a loss of control, which may lead to more problems during that period of transition. So to practice self-compassion and to create strategies to make you more confident going into a period of transition so that the wheels don't come off the bus. And then watching our relationships, right? Am I the only one who thinks I can do this? What is happening? Do I have good relationships with my peers? How are things at home? Falling out. When we see substance use, we sometimes see Monday call-outs and burnout and compassion fatigue, where people start to decome overwork, take more, have weird patterns of states of people where everyone's like, what's going on? And so all those things become very important. So empathy is a finite resource you can run out. It's a normal psychological response. You cannot give of yourself again and again and again without replenishing. Part of being resilient is knowing that there is a finite capability in all of us. So if I could put this on every judicial forehead, courtroom, law firm, I would just have this everywhere just to make you more aware, like the poison control system, that little poison control thing on the back of a Drano, right? you see that, you're like, I'm not drinking that, I'm not pouring that on my skin. But I'm trying to highlight that there is a danger to our profession and our work. And it's not that if there's inherent dangers in the profession, you should just know about it beforehand so you can protect yourself. It's not that you can't do the work. It's just that you have to take extra measures to stay healthy in certain systems. And then you create your own ticket to longevity. So prevention and mitigation go beyond the individual. It goes to the work environment as well. So we need to know work environment matters. One of my biggest things is I would love to develop programs within the judiciary where there are groups where people can get together safely to process some of what they're experiencing in the courtroom. High case loads, difficult cases, right? Because I'm going to tell you, you guys don't feel safe going anywhere else and saying this, right? And how likely are you to go to your presiding judge? And how likely is it going to happen that if you say, you know what, I need a sabbatical, they would be like, what? Like, sorry, that we don't give sabbaticals here. And that's what we need to do more of. We need to be aware that, like the military, there should, right? What we learned from Iran was people got deployed, redeployed, 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 and came back with significant psychological problems that were unremitting. And then we medicated them and medicated them, and they got worse. That is not the solution. That we cannot redeploy and redeploy and redeploy and think that there's not some lasting consequence from that. And so to think of maybe rotational systems so that people, if they ask after a year, maybe we rotate them out for 6 months and then rotate it. The problem is in court settings, the more capable you are, sometimes the more punished we are. You know, you don't get rotated into a low volume courtroom if you're really a good case manager of a high volume courtroom. But we should consider that moving forward to keep people healthier in the profession longer, especially as people work longer, right? People aren't retiring at 65 anymore. So we need a supportive work environment. We need good management. We need good administrators. We need a good boss. And we need them to be really practical about strategies for creating health and wellness in the profession. And, you know, I always say that when we are amongst negativity, it spreads like black fungus, like black mold. And the more we complain and commiserate, it creates more dysfunction in the workplace and leads to higher levels of dysfunction, attrition, and malaise. So I love the fact that this is a committee and that you guys are committed to sustaining the professional self, knowing that you're doing meaningful work. And even the small victories, even the small achievements should be relished and noticed. And recognizing that in order for a judge or attorney to be healthy in the long term, we have to grow, we have to learn, we have to do new things, even if it's uncomfortable for us. We've got to create strategies. We've got to look at caseload, case volume, case types, and say, how sustainable is this over time without decompensation happening in the profession and increasing the feeling and experience of being successful? It's individual, right? And knowing that we have support and mentoring within the profession. So workplace burnout, you know, overloaded cases, a feeling of no control, no rewards, right? We don't get compensated sometimes all the time if we work our butts off. So how do we recognize people who are going above and beyond? And how do we create communities in this hybrid world? And how do we feel a sense of fairness that the work distribution is allocated appropriately? And knowing who we are and what we value in our work, right? Because if you don't like what you do, well, that's going to cause erosion over time as well. So you got to make sure that the fit is good between the person and the job. Now, depleting behaviors is when we don't do anything to encourage health and wellness, right? Do you engage in self-care? Self-care is mandatory. It's not optional. I used to think it was optional, and I inserted it when I could, but it's mandatory. It's mandatory as often as even daily, even if it's 15 minutes. Do you take that for yourself? Do you have peer support? Do you have people to whom you can turn, to who you can process some of these overwhelming situations? Do you have good support? Do you have a good mentor, right, to whom you can turn to? Is there conflict in your community? Are you too serious about everything? And then recognizing that we're all in these imperfect systems, and being an idealistic person may compound misery within the profession, that we need to be more realistic with a sense of idealism infused into it. So if you feel burnout setting in, if you feel demoralized and exhausted, it's best for the sake of everyone to withdraw, not from the whole world, but to withdraw, take a vacation, take some days off, and restore yourself. Self-care is mandatory, it's not optional. So the self-care wheel, I like to say, is not just about, if I'm struggling from a psychological perspective, you may need to seek help, right? Whether it's from lab, from a mental health professional, whether it's through your doctor, whether it's through a support group, whether it's through taking some sort of self-awareness class, right? Do you have people in your life who can support you emotionally? Do you believe in something? You don't have to be religious. Most people are either religious or not, but most people have a value-based level of thinking. And do you know what makes you happy? Do you know what you want to achieve? Are you working towards more of that rather than less of that? Are you happy in your personal life? Are you making time for friends? Do you have sustainable relationships? And then do you feel like you're growing professionally? And of course, physically, are you sleeping? If you don't sleep well, I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you, I do presentations on sleep all the time. If your sleep is crap, you will feel worse. That sleep is meant to be restorative, and it helps keep and make people healthy. So if your sleep is disturbed, we need to take a look at that as well. Now is the time to make yourself a priority as well. Self-care isn't selfish. You cannot serve from an empty vessel. It's really important to note. So self-care barriers is if you always feel like you're the problem solver, the caretaker, if you don't talk about your cases with anyone, if you feel powerless at home, at work, amongst your community, if you blame yourself or others for the situation you're in. I usually, in personal narratives, when people come in, when they first see me, it looks like this. My partner is a problem, my kids are difficult, I hate my supervisor, whatever. Then I'll say, what do you think you're doing in this? Because it seems like everything that is external to you, maybe we can look at some of the internal mechanisms so that we can make you happier. If you deny that you're stressed or burnt out and that you can manage everything on your own, that's part of the problem. We're human beings with limited capacity, and it changes on a daily basis. And then if you don't set boundaries with people at home, people in our personal life, people at work, with our clients, we will erode over time. Putting your fences in cement posts is critical, right? The three little pigs, you don't make a house out of straw. You don't make a house out of stick. You make a house out of brick and you stick with it and learn to say no. You don't have to be on every extracurricular thing. You need to say yes and do it out of happiness and joy. And if you don't do it out of happiness and joy, you should have said no in the first place. So helpful coping strategies. I do presentations on mindfulness. It's very helpful. I know it's hard. I had to buy an inversion table and I suspend myself upside down in order to do it on a daily basis. Work-life balance. Do you have a life? Is it healthy outside of the workforce? Do you have a mentor? Are you taking time to give and receive support? Do you debrief like the military? Are you seeking assistance when you yourself know you are not doing well? And so if your personal life or professional life is being impacted, it's time to seek help. There is no shame in it. I tell people all the time, we're all human sufferers. At one point in our lives, it's like a wave that knocks our feet out from under us, right? You can stand in the ocean maybe for an hour and never have a wave that takes your feet out from underneath you. And then all of a sudden one comes along and you're like, you fall into the sand and you like go back out into the ocean. And that's how life is. And sometimes something happens and we get knocked to the ground. And that's the time to say, I need more support. And if we can help you, or if your EAP or your HR department, or you have someone that you need to turn to someone, you are human beings like anyone else, whether you have a judicial title or not. And we are free, we are confidential. We work with judges all the time. And if we can help you in any way, let us know. And we work with the JIB, we work with lawyers and judges who have disciplinary actions against them. But it's only a phone call away. This is the general number. You can reach me at 630-642-9089, or you can email me, or you can message me on LinkedIn, whatever is easier for you. But don't be afraid. Don't suffer in silence, and know that, you know, at times throughout all of our lives, we will experience 10,000 joys and sorrows, and everyone will experience every single one of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diana. Thank you very much. And this recording will be available for viewing through IJA. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Bye, everyone.